What's up, Divyesh? Morning. We're just going to wait a minute for Roy to get back and we'll get started. Benjamin, let's find our chair. All the way, all the way, all the way in that chair. You guys pick it up. Let's keep our hands down. Good work. Hey, Jack. Good morning. Waiting on Roy. Start rocking and rolling. Hey.
Hey. Yes, 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 yes. Yes, 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 yes. Yes, 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 yes.
Benjamin,
Yes,
you
yes,
know,
yes, 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 yes.
buddy.
Yes, yes, yes.
You know,
Yes, 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 yes.
okay. All right, we're going to get started. All right. So, all right, so in our previous lecture, we were discussing Herbert Hoover's response to the Depression, and just kind of how in the depths of the Depression, just how bad things were for so many people. We began discussing the conditions that led to overproduction and overuse of the land, and which ultimately would lead us into the Dust Bowl. Today we are going to discuss this horrific Dust Bowl, and then we're going to finish up discussing. We're going to finish up the chapter by discussing some cultural changes. You know the drill. We talked about some of the movies or books that came out during this time, and then we are going to look at Hoover's policies, his politics, not just in reference to the Great Depression, but his overall political career, which ultimately is overshadowed by the Great Depression. There he is. No. We definitely don't need you in here if you be used elsewhere. All right, so let's talk about this Dust Bowl. Oh, and after we finish the chapter, I have a cool video about the Dust Bowl. Pretty scary stuff. Oh, and a couple notes that I just wanted to point out before we get into the Dust Bowl that's not included in the text is that the Dust Bowl resulted in the single largest migration of all of American history. And then also so the reason why so many people came in the beginning of this, came and were overusing the land and just we're so dependent on this rainfall is because people actually thought that cultivating the land would affect the rainfall in the area, and they actually had a saying, the rain will follow the plow. So we know that that's not true, and they would ultimately find out in a harsh reality. Okay, so let's get started. Adam, let's get in our seat, bud. All the way in. All the way in our chair. Eyes on that chair. Eyes on that chair. Thank you, sir. Alrighty. So, I'm not really sure where exactly we left off, but we were discussing how the from the turn of the century through much of World War I, the farmers in the Great Plains experienced great prosperity due to the growing conditions. But in 1929, the price of wheat dropped from $2 to 40 cents per bushel. So it is basically impossible to make any money now to even pay your debts. Exacerbating the problem was a massive drought that began in 1931 and lasted for 8 terrible years. Dust storms rolled through the Great Plains, creating huge choking clouds that piled up in doorways and filtered into homes through closed windows. Even more quickly than it had boomed, the land of the agricultural opportunity went bust due to widespread overproduction and overuse of the land, as well as the harsh weather conditions that followed, resulting in the creation of the Dust Bowl. Livestock died or had to be sold as there was no money for feed. Crops intended to feed the family withered and died in the drought. Terrifying dust storms became more and more frequent as black blizzards of dirt blew across the landscape and created a new illness known as dust pneumonia, pneumonia. In 1935 alone, over 850 million tons of topsoil blew away. To put this number into perspective, geologists estimate that it takes the Earth 500 years to naturally regenerate just 1 inch of topsoil. Yet just one significant dust storm could destroy a similar amount. So in their desperation to get more from the land, farmers had stripped it of the delicate balance that kept it healthy. Unaware of the consequences, they had moved away from such traditions as crop rotation and allowing the land to regain its strength by permitting it to lie fallow, which means not planting anything between plantings, working the land to death. They literally worked the land to death. So for farmers, the results were catastrophic. Unlike most factory workers in the cities, in most cases, farmers lost their homes when they lost their livelihood. Most farms and ranches were originally mortgaged to small country banks that understood the dynamics of farming. But as these banks failed, they often sold rural mortgages to larger Eastern banks that were less concerned with the specific of farm life. So what's going to happen? Foreclosure. Adam, you need to use the bathroom? You need to go?
Go.
Okay, let's go. You need to use the restroom? Or do you want to sit down? You sit down? Get in that chair. Why? Come on. All right. Sorry about that, guys. All right, so they worked the land to death. These banks were selling the mortgages to Eastern banks, which would ultimately end in foreclosure. With the effects of the drought and low commodity prices, farmers could not pay their local banks, which in turn lacked funds to pay the larger banks. Ultimately, the banks foreclosed on the farm, often swallowing up the small country banks in the process. It is worth noting that of the 5,000 banks that closed between 1930 and 1932, over 75% were the country banks in locations with populations under 2,500. So given this dynamic, it is easy to see why farmers in the Great Plains remained weary of big city bankers. So I don't know if you've ever seen the movies where they're like saying, oh, they big city slickers coming in, the bankers, they don't like bankers. That's kind of where this opinion comes from. So for farmers who survived the initial crash, the situation worsened, particularly in the Great Plains, where years of overproduction and rapidly declining commodity prices took their toll. Prices continued to decline, and as farmers tried to stay afloat, they produced still more crops, which drove prices even lower. Farms failed at an astounding rate, and farmers sold at rock bottom prices. One farm in Shelby, Nebraska, was mortgaged at $4,100, and sold for $49.50. That's pretty horrible. 1/4 of the entire state of Mississippi was auctioned off in a single day at a foreclosure auction in April of 1932. Not all farmers tried to keep their land. Many, especially those who had arrived only recently in an attempt to capitalize on the earlier prosperity, simply walked away. In hard-hit Oklahoma, thousands of farmers picked up what they could and walked away or drove away if they had a car or a buggy. They drove away from the land, and they thought that the land that they thought would be their future at one point. They, along with other displaced farmers from throughout the Great Plains, became known as Okies, O-K-I-E-S, Okies. Okies were an emblem of the failure of the American breadbasket to deliver on its promise, and their story was made famous by John Steinbeck's Steinbecks novel, The Grapes of Wrath. All right, so we have an account here from the Dust Bowl. Pretty interesting. Now we are facing a 4th year of failure. There can be no wheat for us in 1935, in spite of all our careful and expensive work in preparing ground, sowing and resowing our allocated acreage. Native grass pastures are permanently damaged, in many cases hopelessly ruined, smothered under by drifted sand. Fences are buried under banks of thistles and hard-packed earth, or undermined by the eroding action of the wind, and lying flat on the ground. Less traveled roads are impassable, covered deep under by sand or the finer silt-like loam, L-O-A-M. Orchards, groves, and hedgerows, cultivated for many years with patient care, are dead or dying. Impossible, it seems, to grieve that the work of hands should prove so perishable. And that's from Caroline Henderson of Shelton, Oklahoma in 1935. So much like other farm families whose livelihoods were destroyed by the Dust Bowl, Caroline Henderson describes the level of hardship that many Americans living in depression-ravaged cities could never understand. Despite their hard work, millions of Americans were losing both their produce and their homes, sometimes in as little as 48 hours, to environmental catastrophes. Lacking any other explanation, many began to question what they had done to incur God's wrath. Note in particular Henderson's reference to dead, dying, and perishable, and contrast those terms with her depiction of the careful and expensive work undertaken by their own hands. Many simply could not understand how such a catastrophe could have occurred. Again, like I said in the at the end of this lecture, we will watch a video that kind of shows and explains how bad these storms were. So in the decades before the Great Depression, and particularly in the 1920s, American culture largely reflected the values of individualism. Get out of here, buddy. Turn around.
Come on, Ken.
Yeah.
Corey, you want to come to the gym, bud? Head downstairs.
Right. Sorry, where was I?
Why don't you bring it back here? You can bring your water.
So in the decades before the Great Depression, and particularly in the 1920s, American culture largely reflected the values of individualism, self-reliance, and material success through competition. Novels like F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby and Sinclair Lewis's Babbitt, B-A-B-B-I-T, Gatsby, G-A-T-S-B-Y, portrayed wealth and the self-made man in America, albeit in a critical fashion. In film, many silent movies such as Charlie Chaplin's The Gold Rush depicted the rags to riches stories or fables that Americans so loved. With the shift in U.S. fortunes, however, came a shift in values, and with it, a new cultural reflection. The arts revealed a new emphasis on the welfare of the whole and the importance of community in preserving family life. While box office sales briefly declined at the beginning of the Depression, they quickly rebounded. Movies offered a way for Americans. Let's get those hands down, Benjamin. Benjamin. Thank you. A way for Americans to think of better times, and people were willing to pay 25 cents for a chance to escape, at least for a few hours. Even more than escapism, other films at the close of the decade reflected on the sense of community and family values that Americans struggled to maintain throughout the entire Depression. John Ford's screen version of Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath came out in 1940, portraying the haunting story of the Joad, J-O-A-D, family's exodus from the Oklahoma farm to California in search of a better life. Their journey leads them to realize that they need to join a larger social movement, communism, dedicated to bettering the lives of all people. Tom Joad says, well, maybe it's like Casey says, a fella ain't got a soul of his own, but only a piece of a soul, the one big soul that belongs to everybody. The great lesson learned was one of strength of community in the face of individual adversity. Another trope was that of the hardworking everyman against greedy banks and corporations. So we kind of discussed that when we discussed the farm situation. This was perhaps best portrayed in the movies of Frank Capra, whose Mr. Smith Goes to Washington was emblematic of his work. In 1939, Jimmy Stewart plays a legislator sent to Washington to finish out the term of a deceased senator. While there, he fights corruption to ensure the construction of a boys' camp in his hometown, rather than a dam project that would only serve to line the pockets of a few. He ultimately engages in a 2-day filibuster, standing up to the power players to do what's right. The Depression era was a favorite of Capra's to depict in his films, including It's a Wonderful Life, released in 1946. In this film, Jimmy Stewart runs a family-owned savings and loan, which at one point faces a bank run similar to those mentioned earlier. In the end, community support helps Stewart retain his business and home against the unscrupulous actions of a wealthy banker who sought to bring ruin to his family. So we got family values as being a major part of popular culture during this time. Finally, there was a great deal of pure escapism in the popular culture of the Depression. Even the songs found in films reminded many viewers of the bygone days of prosperity and happiness. From Al Dubin, D-U-B-I-N, and Henry Warren, W-A-R-R-E-N, their hit, We're in the Money, to the popular Happy Days Are Here Again, The latter eventually became the theme song of Franklin Roosevelt's 1932 presidential campaign. People wanted to forget their worries and enjoy the madcap antics of the Marx Brothers, M-A-R-X, the youthful charm of Shirley Temple, the dazzling dances of Fred Astaire, A-S-T-A-I-R-E, and Ginger Rogers, or the comforting morals of Andy Hardy, A-N-D-Y-H-A-R-D-Y. So the Hardy series, 9 films in all, produced by MGM from 1936 to 1940, starred Judy Garland, G-A-R-L-A-N-D, and Mickey Rooney, R-O-O-N-E-Y. All followed the adventures of small-town Judge and his son. No matter what the challenge, it was never so big that it could not be solved with a musical production put on by the neighborhood kids, bringing together friends and family members in a warm display of community values. All right. So all of these movies reinforced traditional American values, which suffered during these hard times, in part due to the declining marriage and birth rates and increased domestic violence at the same time. So you guys can also consider this when we are talking about our, discuss the pandemic, and they are definitely different kind of hard times, but they are definitely still hard times. So this whole chapter can kind of be, related to through the pandemic. So this was in part due to declining marriage and birth rates, increased domestic violence, and at the same time, however, they reflected an increased interest in sex and sexuality. While the birth rate was dropping, surveys in Fortune magazine in 1936 and 37 found that 2/3 of college students favored birth control, and that 50% of men and 25% of women admitted to premarital sex, continuing a trend among younger Americans that had begun to emerge in the 1920s. Contraceptive sales soared during this decade, and again, culture reflected this shift. Blonde bombshell Mae West, M-A-E-W-E-S-T, was famous for her sexual innuendos, and her flirtatious persona was hugely popular, although it got her banned on radio broadcasts throughout the Midwest. Whether West or Garland, Chaplin or Stewart, American film continued to be a barometer of American values and their challenges through the decade. All right, so kind of discuss some of the different arts, mostly movies. Let's discuss some of the aspects of Hoover's presidency, not necessarily directly related to the Great Depression, which is hard to do. So as so much of the Hoover presidency is circumscribed by the onset of the Great Depression, one must be careful in assessing his successes and failures, so as not to attribute all blame to Hoover. Given the suffering that many Americans endured between the fall of 1929 and Franklin Roosevelt's inauguration in the spring of 1933, it's easy to lay much of the blame at Hoover's doorstep. However, the extent to which Hoover was constrained by the economic circumstances unfolding well before he assumed his office offers a few mitigating factors. So put simply, Hoover did not cause the stock market to crash. We know that. However, his stubborn adherence to a questionable belief in American individualism, despite mounting evidence that people were starving, requires that some blame be attributed to his policies or lack thereof for the depth and length of the Depression. Yet Hoover's presidency was much more than simply combating the Depression. To assess the extent of his inability to provide meaningful national leadership through the darkest months of the Depression, his other policies require consideration. All right, so although it was a relatively quiet period for U.S. diplomacy, Hoover did help to usher in a period of positive relations, specifically with several Latin American neighbors. This would establish the basis for Franklin Roosevelt's good neighbor policy. Hands down, Benji. Thank you. After a goodwill tour of Central American countries immediately following his election in 1928, Hoover shaped the subsequent Clark Memorandum, C-L-A-R-K, M-E-M-O-R-A-N-D-U-M, Clark Memorandum. I'll write it up here. D-U-M, sorry guys. All right, so the Clark Memorandum was released in 1930, and it largely repudiated the previous Roosevelt corollary, establishing a basis for unlimited American intervention throughout Latin America. To the contrary, though, the memorandum, Hoover asserted that greater emphasis should be placed on the old Monroe Doctrine, in which the U.S. pledged to assistance to her Latin American neighbors should any European powers interfere in Western Hemisphere affairs. Hoover further strengthened relations to the South by withdrawing American troops from Haiti and Nicaragua. Additionally, he outlined with Secretary of State Henry Stimson, S-T-I-M-S-O-N, the Hoover-Stimson Doctrine. So this is kind of a big deal. Hoover-Stimson Doctrine. So this announces that the United States would never recognize claims to territories seized by force, a response to the recent Japanese invasion of Manchuria. So it's a little hypocritical, but I guess moving in the right direction. So other diplomatic overtures met with less success for Hoover, most notably in an effort to support the American economy during the early stages of the Depression. The president signed into law the Smoot-Hawley, S-M-O-O-T-H-A-W-L-E-Y. Smoot-Hawley tariff. And we know what tariffs are. And we know how they, in the past, have actually ended up hurting the American economy, despite the fact that they're, created to help the economy or protect American interests. So it raised tariffs on thousands of imports, which was intended to increase sales of American-made goods, but predictably angered foreign trade partners, who in turn raised their tariffs on American imports, thus shrinking international trade and closing additional markets to desperate American manufacturers. As a result, the global depression worsened further. A similar attempt to spur the world economy, known as the Hoover Moratorium. Hoover, the Hoover Moratorium likewise met with great opposition and little success, economic benefit. Issued in 1931, the moratorium called for a halt to World War I reparations to be paid by Germany to France, as well as forgiveness of Allied war debts to the U.S. That's a big deal. So what about civil rights? We know that this is just an ongoing problem. Holding true to his belief in individualism, Hoover saw little need for significant civil rights legislation during his presidency, including any overtures from the NAACP to endorse federal anti-lynching legislation. He felt that African Americans would benefit more from education and assimilation rather than from federal legislation or programs. Little government intervention as possible. That's kind of his motto, right? Um, but he failed to recognize that at this time in history, federal legislation and programs were required to ensure equal opportunities, which they did not, African Americans did not have during this time. Hoover did give special attention to the improvement of Native American conditions, beginning with his selection of Charles Curtis, Curtis, as his vice presidential running mate in 1928. Curtis, of the Kaw tribe, K-A-W, became the country's first Native American to hold so high an elected office. Hoover subsequently appointed Charles Rhodes, R-H-O-A-D-S, as the new commissioner of the Bureau of Indian Affairs and advocated with Rhodes assistance for Native American self-sufficiency and full assimilation as Americans under the Indian Citizenship Act of 1924. During Hoover's presidency, federal expenditures for Native American schools and healthcare doubled. All right. So, final assessment, Herbert Hoover's presidency embarked upon with such promise following the election of November of 1928, produced a legacy of mixed reactions. Some Americans blamed him for all the economic and social woes from which they suffered for the next decade. All blamed him simply not responding to their needs. As contemporary commentator and actor Will Rogers said at the time, if an American was lucky enough to find an apple to eat in the Depression and bit into it and found a worm, they would blame Hoover for the worm. Likewise, subsequent public opinion polls of presidential popularity, as well as polls of professional historians, routinely rate Hoover in the bottom 7 of all U.S. presidents in terms of overall success. However, Hoover, the president, was a product of his time. Americans sought a president in 1928 who would continue the policies of normalcy with which many associated the prosperity they enjoyed. They wanted a president who would forego government interference and allow industrial capitalism to grow unfettered. Hoover, from his days as the Secretary of Commerce, was the ideal candidate. In fact, he was too ideal when the Great Depression actually hit, holding steadfast to his philosophy of American individualism. Hoover proved largely incapable of shifting into economic crisis mode when Americans came to realize that prosperity could not last forever. So desperate to help, but unwilling to compromise on his philosophy, Hoover could not manage a comprehensive solution to the worldwide depression that few foresaw. Only when re-election was less than a year away did a reluctant Hoover initiate significant policies, but even then, they did not provide enough direct relief, or any direct relief, sorry. By the start of 1932, unemployment hovered near 25%, and thousands of banks and factories were closing their doors. Combined with Hoover's ill-timed response to the bonus army crisis, his political fate was sealed. Americans would look to the next president for a solution. Democracy is a harsh employer, Hoover concluded as he awaited all but certain defeat in the November election of 1932. All right, so I feel like we've talked about all of the 1930s, but we've only talked about Herbert Hoover as the president. So what is to come? Well, we know Franklin Roosevelt is coming. But before we get to that, let's watch a video on the Dust Bowl. Okay, so we know why the Dust Bowl started, so I'm going to skip that part.
This video is brought to you by Squarespace. From websites, marketing tools, and analytics, Squarespace is the all-in-one platform to build a...
Okay. Sorry guys, we're getting there. Which takes a second when I plug it in. Sorry guys, my computer is not cooperating. Okay, buddy.
domain, or super easy to manage. My recommendation, just use a template. No excuses. And once you've gone through the easy customization process, no updates, no patches, no tech nonsense for you to deal with. There's also 24/7 customer support who are there to help you whenever you've got a question. So head to squarespace.com for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/geographic.
Oh, come on.
With the onset of drought in 1930, the barren topsoil was
Goodness. Sorry, guys. Having some technical difficulties. There we go.
Depositing 12 million pounds of dust in Chicago within 2 more. Instead of drought in 1930, the barren topsoil was left exposed with no rain or grasses to hold it down, and strong winds picked up thousands of tons of dust. As the wind carried the dust, it turned into a fine powder and created gigantic dust storms. Enormous dust storms became commonplace across the Great Plains in the early 1930s, coating everything in their path with a powdery red dust. By 1934, 35 million acres of land previously used for farming had been rendered useless. An additional 125 million acres was losing its topsoil. In May 1934, a particularly powerful 2-day dust storm rampaged across South Dakota, and the powder carried some 700 miles east before depositing 12 million pounds of dust in Chicago. Within 2 more days, the same storm traveled another 800 miles east, dumping red powder across the East Coast cities like New York, Washington, D.C., and Boston, to name a few. In winter of the same year, red snow fell in New England. There are even several instances of red dust coating ships in the western Atlantic Ocean. Closer to the epicenter of these black blizzards, conditions were much worse. Clouds of dust, sometimes miles high, blotted out the sun for days at a time. The dust collected in drifts like an apocalyptic snowstorm, and residents were often forced to clear the mountains of grain with shovels. Even in the most well-built and sealed homes of the time, the dust sought out any openings and infiltrated every surface of the building, leaving coating on floors, furniture, food, and even the unfortunate residents of such homes. The worst of all the storms hit on April the 14th, 1935. It's estimated that 3 million tons of topsoil gathered in the air above the Oklahoma Panhandle on that day alone, and the dust from the storm carried east and coated several entire states. News reporting on the storm nicknamed the day Black Sunday for the ominous nature in which the sun disappeared behind the towering wall of darkness. Hoovers. One report of this storm coined the term Dust Bowl to describe the plain states most directly impacted by frequent dust storms, and this phrase soon caught on and became the de facto descriptor of the dust storms and the region in which they occurred. The human impact of the Dust Bowl. Thousands of Midwesterners developed dust pneumonia, which caused chest pains and shortness of breath, and in severe cases could result in record exists of how many lives were lost as a direct result of dust pneumonia, but estimates range from hundreds well into the thousands. Beyond those facing serious medical conditions from the dust, millions more suffered the consequences in other aspects of life. School closures were commonplace during this period, as it was physically dangerous for students and teachers to travel to and from schools. Teacher Taletta Elfeld recounts, "One day in March 1934, my beginners were busy reading. All of a sudden, there was a total darkness. It was as though a huge curtain had been drawn around our building. I realized the dust had hit because soon the room was filled with a fog of dust. We teachers walked home holding wet towels over our faces in order to breathe. In other instances, teachers recall lighting lanterns during the middle of the day so children could see to recite their lessons. There are even cases of teachers keeping students in the schoolhouse through the night so that they wouldn't get lost walking home or be overcome by dust. The severe droughts that lasted throughout the 1930s, combined with irregular black blizzards, killed crops across hundreds of millions of acres. By 1936, the economic cost of the storms reached $25 million a day, equivalent to $460 million in today's money. The billions of dollars lost each year further exacerbated the Great Depression, and thousands of farm families feared starvation. The especially poor economy in the Dust Bowl region forced millions of Americans to migrate to other states, especially California. It was not just farmers who were affected. By examining census statistics, the bleak picture becomes more clear. Only 43% of those who moved to California during the 1930s were immediately before arrival, and about one-third of these new arrivals were either professional white-collar workers not involved in agriculture at all. This is reflective of how entire economies of Dust Bowl states collapsed, leaving teachers, doctors, police, and anyone who lived in these communities with no choice but to flee the region. In the 1930s, approximately 3.5 million residents fled the Great Plains states and migrated elsewhere. As mentioned previously, this made the Dust Bowl exodus the largest single migration in US history. The hardest hit state was Oklahoma, who lost over 440,000 residents between 1930 and 1940, most of whom traveled west to look for work. Around 250,000 of these poverty-stricken Oklahomans settled in California between 1935 and 1940, particularly agriculturally rich San Joaquin Valley. The impact on population in the Dust Bowl states lasted for decades, with the hardest-hit counties experiencing population growth. About 1 in 8 Californians today can trace their heritage to Okie descent, a startling reminder of the sheer volume of migrants in dire straits during the height of the drought. This type of migratory Midwesterner was so common that the term Okie became common derogatory slang for those from any Dust Bowl state seeking respite from dusty homelands. These Okies were the subject of harsh discrimination, often being subjected to the most menial labor tasks and unsustainable low wages upon arrival in California. The level of desperation among Okies was such that they had no choice but to accept whatever pitiable job and wage they were offered, and Californian farmers in need of cheap labor took full advantage of the miserable reality. Already faced with an unprecedented economic depression, with the prospect of another global conflict on the horizon, the US government did not immediately jump to action to aid those suffering as a result of the Dust Bowl. Federal aid was first given in 1932 to the drought-affected states, but it was not until the fall of 1933 that the federal government reallocated funds with the specific intention of drought relief. A number of federal agencies were established between 1933 and 1935 in order to help poverty-stricken or displaced farmers. In 1935, President Franklin D. Roosevelt directly addressed the environmental degradation that allowed for the Dust Bowl in the first place, as he enacted the Prairie States Forest Project. The program had local farmers plant trees to act as windbreaks on farms in the Plain States in an attempt to mitigate the effects
You got 1 minute?
of dust storms. The Soil Erosion
You got 1
Service
minute,
was also
buddy.
established by Roosevelt in 1935
Okay.
for the same purpose, and it showed farmers safer cultivation techniques that
All right, let's go. Everybody up on your feet. Get your stuff. Adam, go get your water bottle. Or stand up. Everybody up. Up. Ancho, get all these things.
The Rock Ray Johnson. The Rock Ray Johnson. It's not like the Rock. The Rock Ray Johnson.
No, it's not about. Why can't I say his name?
Rock Ray Johnson.
Hey guys! Adam, 90 funkin' calories.
I like his shirt. Like he has fries on his shirt. And he has
Can I have a fry?
You know, don't worry. No, out.
No, I see the commercial.
Are you still recording right
I got so.
now? Jeez.
Bye, guys.
Zebra cakes.
Still
Mr. Joe, Mr. Joe, maybe once.
Whoa.
Bye.